Welcome to the Daily Bell Ringer. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Great Compromise. So the Great Compromise is something that or the Great Compromise, otherwise known as the Connecticut Plan, is something that comes out of the Constitutional Convention. Again, before we talked about, how the need for a new constitution and how the delegates had gotten together there in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to start writing this new constitution. All right, but one of the biggest issues that arises here is this issue of representation. All right, what are we going to have? Are the large states going to have control? Are the small states going to have control? How are we really going to have a fair system of representation when we have states with vastly different populations in them? All right, and so we have a couple different plans that are put forth. Okay, the first plan is this plan that is primarily written by future President James Madison is really the main author of this plan known as the Virginia Plan, and it called for a strong national federal government. All right, that basically the federal government was going to have more power really than the states, and that the federal government was going to have power to tax. It also called for representation to be based on population. That's something that's known as proportional representation. So in other words, the larger the population a state has, the more representatives they're going to have in the government. All right, and so that this is a big issue because the states with a lot of population really like this plan because it was going to give them more power. Also within this plan, it called for 3 branches of government and a bicameral legislature. Okay, so what I mean by bicameral, I mean there's 2 houses. There's an upper and a lower house of the legislature. So like our Congress today, it has 2 houses. So within the Virginia plan, basically what it called for was there would be a lower house. And those representatives would be actually voted on by the people. And then there would be an upper house that would be appointed from the lower house. So in other words, the upper house would not be voted upon by the people. It would be appointed from the people who were the guys that were voted into the lower house. All right. It would also, within this, it called for there to be a president, and the president would be chosen by the legislature, not by the people. And then it also called for a judicial branch with judges being appointed by the legislature. All right. And so again, this was the plan that was really favored by the states with bigger populations. But then there's another plan, I guess you could say the small state plan, otherwise known as the New Jersey plan. And under the New Jersey plan, honestly, they don't really veer very far away from the Articles of Confederation and the way the government had been set up before. It called for a weak federal government with, again, most of the power going to the states. However, in the plan, it did say the federal government should have the right to tax, which was one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation. But they said that every single state should have the same number of representatives regardless of the population, regardless of the size of the state. So everybody gets just an equal vote no matter how many people live in each state. It did call for 3 houses of the government, of course called for a legislature, but instead of having it bicameral, they said just have 1 house, kind of like the way it had already been set up under the Articles of Confederation with the Continental Congress. So they said just have 1 house of the legislature. They said we would have a president, and the president would be chosen from the legislature, and then the judges in the judicial branch would be chosen by the president. Okay, and so this is the plan that the smaller states were really in favor of. And so this really becomes a big issue. I mean, this is like, the whole Continental Congress, they spend, months debating this whole issue of how are they going to represent, the large states versus the small states. And is it going to be equal representation or proportional representation? And it really looked like things were really going to fall apart until eventually Roger Sherman of Connecticut comes up with this plan to kind of melt the 2 plans together. And actually, if you look at our government today, this is really how it ended up. This Connecticut plan, or the Great Compromise, is what we ended up with. Okay, so in this Great Compromise, basically said, okay, we are going to have a bicameral legislature. We're going to have 2 houses. So if you think the way our government is today, we have in Congress, we have a lower house known as the House of Representatives that is based on proportional representation. So big states like California have lots of representatives, like 53, whereas small states with small populations like Wyoming might only have 4 representatives in Congress. And I'm including representatives in the House as well as representatives in the Senate as well. Okay, and so they said this lower house is going to be proportional based on population, and it's going to be voted on by the people. All right, then there's going to be an upper house known as the Senate, which of course we have today, which would have equal representation with each state getting 2 representatives. So that's the way it is today. No matter how big a state is, they still only get 2 senators. And so again, California, even though they have a gigantic population, they only have 2 senators. Whereas a tiny little state like, Idaho, they have 2 senators as well. So that's where we get the equal representation. Now, initially, when they first decided on this, they said that the legislature will vote on the Senate. And actually, that's the way it was for many years until the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913 that gave the people the right to vote for senators. All right. And so what we end up seeing here with this great compromise is this is how they settled the issue of representation. Again, lower house had proportional representation, voted on by the people. The upper house had equal representation. And again, eventually the people do get the vote. So hopefully you learned something there about the great compromise, and I will talk to you later. Thanks.